This podcast is intended for a mature audience over 19 years of age and is provided on an educational and informational basis. Any material presented is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for professional medical advice or as an endorsement or medical claim by Pattison Media, Everything Podcast, or Ripco.pro.
The Canadian podcast is growing. Our team just got a little bigger. And we're adding a new voice to the show. We have a new host who's going to add some star power to the show. One that I'm really thrilled to be with. There's a park in Whistler named after him. His name is so closely tied to cannabis that people go there just to smoke pot. He's a world-class athlete, an Olympic champion, and the first gold medalist ever in his sport. But he's also a campaigner and an advocate for cannabis. He's an entrepreneur with his own brand of pot. And that brand and that park aren't the only things that bear our new host's name. The rule which bans cannabis at the Olympics is named after him.
Ross Rebagliati, Canada!
Welcome to the new and improved Canadian podcast with me, Don Schaefer.
And me, Ross Rebagliati.
Ross is the guy who won the first ever snowboarding gold medal at the Olympics. Then he had it revoked when he tested positive for cannabis. His medal was reinstated on appeal because cannabis wasn't actually banned at the Games. When they did add it to the list of banned substances, the New York Times called it the Rebagliati rule. That was in the year 2000, and Ross became something of a cannabis anti-hero after that. But even though he was a bona fide Olympic champion, his snowboarding career was pretty much over at that point. So over the next 2 decades, Ross took his newfound fame and reinvented himself with it.
That was, for me, it was a personal quest that I was on to right the wrongs that I felt that I'd been given at the time and to play the best hand that I could to resurrect my name, my family name, and to also stand up for the people that supported me in cannabis and the people who use cannabis.
Ross is going to guide our journalism with his industry insider expertise, and he'll be interviewing some of the leading figures in cannabis.
Cannabis doesn't seem like it, but it's a broad topic. It really does touch all parts of society and all parts of life for an individual and can be used for so many different things. I felt like if there was a podcast that I could be involved in where we can dive into, some of those specific things, one podcast at a time, and really kind of open the can with regards to cannabis use and trying to understand it better, understand the plant better, understand the industry better, and even understand, why people use cannabis.
We couldn't be happier to welcome Ross Rebagliati to the Canadian podcast. And we're going to spend the show today getting to know him better. Ross and I are in conversation after the pot news with Jay Coburn.
With the pot news, I'm Jay Coburn. The US government has confirmed that cannabis will be classified as a less dangerous drug at the federal level. Currently, it is Schedule 1, defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This list includes things like heroin and LSD. The Justice Department proposal would move cannabis to Schedule 3, which recognizes the medical uses of cannabis, but does not legalize it for recreational use. Over half of Americans do have access to cannabis that is legal at the state level already, but this change would make it easier to study cannabis and potentially reduce the tax burden on cannabis businesses. Thailand, however, is going in the opposite direction. Just 2 years after ending prohibition, they're looking to ban cannabis again. In 2022, the nation became the first in Asia to legalize weed for recreational use, leading to the rapid growth of a new cannabis industry and associated tourism. The sector had been projected to be worth $1.25 billion by 2025, but that was under a previous government, and opponents argued that the move was rushed and poorly regulated. The current Prime Minister has asked the Health Ministry in Thailand to relist cannabis as a narcotic by the end of the year. And here in Canada, in a stereotype-challenging study, researchers at the University of Toronto have published a paper showing that regular cannabis users do not show decreased levels of motivation, and in fact, in some cases, were more motivated and able to concentrate for longer periods of time. The study looked at a broad range of emotional effects and found that getting high was associated with more positive emotions and fewer negative emotions. And the researchers say that, contrary to expectations, regular users experienced a surprising lack of costs to motivation and industriousness. That's the Pot News. I'm Jay Coburn.
All right, so let me officially welcome Ross Rebagliati to the Canadian podcast. It's very cool to have you here.
My pleasure, Don. I'm hoping that you feel the same way after a couple of podcasts, but I'm interested to learn more about it and get better at being part of the interview instead of always being interviewed. So, yeah, it should be fun.
It's Midori Ito, the most decorated figure skater in Japan history. She will light the cauldron.
For most Olympic champions, there's stories about the journey to the Olympics, the struggle, and the glory. Ross is different. That part is really just the prelude. It's kind of an epic prelude, though. He was the first person to ever win gold in snowboarding at the Olympics. Nagano, Japan, in 1998, was the first time the then-infant sport of snowboarding appeared at the Games. Ross was in his mid-20s, and he competed in the giant slalom. It's a technical speed event, with riders racing down the hill at around 140 kilometers an hour.
Our event was the first event on the first day of Nagano. And so the day before the race, we had the opening ceremonies. It was incredible walking into the stadium, having a full stadium, people cheering, the jets flying over, the Olympic music, the Olympic flame. All of those things were like so motivating to me and kind of gave me the energy that I was looking for from the Olympics and what I imagined the Olympics would be like.
Canada.
Ross's first run of two was a little bumpy.
He's in 8th place. After the first run, he was a half second back.
He was firmly in the middle of the field, and he'd have to make up a lot of time on his second run if he was to win. So he ducked out to eat a bunch of spaghetti at the hotel.
And when I got into the hotel, lunch had just ended 5 minutes before I got there. So they weren't going to give me my lunch. And I literally jumped over the counter and went into the kitchen. Like, I'm going to get my spaghetti no matter what.
The odds were stacked against the Canadian team. They didn't have the resources of some of the other nations.
I had to tune my board. I waxed my board again for the second run on the floor of the hotel in the hallway, plugged my iron into the socket at the bottom of the doorway there and waxed my board in the hallway. Meanwhile, all the other big teams around the world have like professional technicians tuning their gear with machines and everything. And I'm like on my knees, waxing my board, trying not to drip wax on the carpet. As Canadians, we had to like fight for our position in the global realm of things to be at the Olympics and to qualify and to be successful. And I think, you know, when you see a Canadian athlete winning gold, there's so much more that went into it by that person. Sacrifice, not having enough money, not being with family and friends, and the whole 9 yards. When you see an Olympic gold medal coming out of Canada, that's dedication right there.
The run was delayed because of bad weather. Ross, shivering, trying to keep warm, waited at the top.
I remember being in the start hut and my coach was halfway down the mountain, wanted to give me a course report, asked me what I wanted to know, and I was in my head, I was thinking like, I've been doing this for 10 years. There's nothing you can tell me right now that's going to make a difference. It's do or die. Like, I'm going to jump out of the airplane in about 2 seconds. It's going to have to be a reflex. If it happens, I'm going to have to deal with it at the time. And so I just asked him what time the award ceremonies were at, just as like a little joke. And so he just laughed on the radio, and then it was radio silence after that. And then it was the 10-second countdown to my run finally.
Set up and slightly ahead, so Ross, if he can hold it together, and he's fighting it right now for all it's worth, if he can hold it together, he could be in there. So at the end of the last few gates, sets it down a bit, but doesn't scrub too much speed.
Oh, he's not holding
left
back.
to go.
Oh, and there's the time. Ross Rebagliati of Whistler, British Columbia takes over the lead.
I am kind of speechless right now. I don't know what to say. I'm just glad everyone's watching back home and all my friends, my dad's here, and got a lot of friends on tour wishing me good luck and everything. It's just a beautiful experience.
We had the award ceremonies after the race, and we had celebrations at the hotel that night.
Ross Rebagliati, Canada.
オリンピックチャンピオン、ゴールドメダリスト、ロス・レバリアティ、カナダ。
But just 72 hours after Ross's gold medal run, the sweet taste of victory turned sour.
And then the next morning, by around 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 coaches came into my room where there was a bunch of people like checking out the gold medal, because none of us had even seen Olympic gold medals before. And so the huge novelty to have one. The coaches told everybody to leave and for me to stay and maybe even sit down.
Ross had been off cannabis for about 6 months. He'd been to parties in Whistler where other people were smoking, but he'd also been drug tested before he went to Japan. He'd heard no news, so no news is good news, right? After all, he qualified for the team. So Ross figured he must have inadvertently taken something banned and gathered all his supplements and protein powders into a bag to get tested. But Ross was told that he actually had tested positive for cannabis.
Then they released the results of my 3 drug tests I did before I went to Nagano, where it showed that I tested positive for cannabis in all of those tests. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, how would they even let me go for this to happen in the first place?
We should probably point out that the threshold for a positive cannabis test has since been raised to over 10 times what it was when Ross tested positive to avoid secondhand smoke raising flags.
We made our first 2 appeals that we lost to the International Olympic Committee, which was just me sitting in front of a big table of 35 representatives from around the world.
Then it went to the Court of Arbitration.
By this point, I'm already in jail. They'd put me in jail in Japan. And I'm waiting in jail for the results of the arbitration.
The drug testers had gone around the IOC and called the police. Japan has particularly strict drug laws, and so Ross was taken to the local jail where the cops didn't seem to know what they were dealing with.
They were asking me, like, how you smoke weed and how it makes you feel and why you would smoke it and all these kind of questions. It got to the point where they couldn't understand how we smoked it, so I grabbed one of his cigarettes and broke it apart and then rolled up the tobacco again into a little joint to sort of demonstrate how we would do it.
Meanwhile, at the Court of Arbitration, it became clear that Ross hadn't broken any rules, whether he'd smoked cannabis deliberately or not.
The results from the arbitration were that cannabis wasn't on the list of banned substances.
So Ross was exonerated, his medal was reinstated, and he was released from Japanese jail.
Please welcome Ross Rebagliati.
Within 24 hours, I was in Burbank, California, doing The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. It was just like a gong show of me becoming a celebrity and hanging out with celebrities and flying around in private jets to Aspen and smoking weed with the Rolling Stones backstage before their concerts and just doing unbelievable things.
Ross became a very different sort of celebrity to most gold medalists. He was the anti-hero, the proud pothead. Not only did he stick up for his weed-smoking buddies on TV, he did it with a sense of humor.
And they told me it was marijuana. And I was just like, holy smokes, this isn't good. And holy smokes? Yeah.
It goes to your head, too, like being known and people are flying you around in private jets and you're meeting famous people. And you kind of feel like somehow that you should be participating in that sort of success, but really you're not, you're just there.
But fame doesn't necessarily pay the bills. Winning a gold medal didn't come with any prize money. And the U.S., in the depths of prohibition at the time, put Ross on a no-fly list. That effectively ended his career as a snowboarder.
Since I was 15, I was a pro snowboarder. And I was doing great at it. And all of a sudden at 26, I found myself kind of like no sponsors, travel issues with international travel, being known for a Schedule 1 substance.
It was a long journey from cannabis anti-hero to the businessman, campaigner, and podcast host that Ross is today. As Ross was saying, it wasn't always a smooth ride. We're going to hang out and chat here for a while. I want to get to know my new colleague better, so let's start with that period after the Olympics, after the whirlwind of fame died down.
You know, not having a way to earn a living anymore, and then to reinvent myself, you know, as a carpenter. And yeah, there was a lot of times where I really didn't know what I was going to do, and I ran out of money lots of times, and basically living in poverty for a number of years, trying to figure out, you know, what my next steps were, I knew that the cannabis thing was something that had potential to become something, but in 1998 to 2010, I mean, it was kind of like a pipe dream that anything legal would ever arise, you know, with regards to cannabis. And being a known person, I didn't want to get into the illegal side of cannabis, but I was still doing a lot of interviews in the media talking out on behalf of cannabis and people who use cannabis. So I knew that the platform I had legs to it, and, you know, maybe if we just talked about it more and more over the years, and that's what I did for 25 years, was to sort of bring normalization to cannabis use. Maybe we could open up some opportunities, and then legalization came to us, which even the most hardcore activists didn't think we would see recreational use of cannabis in our lifetime. So it was a bit of a surprise, but also an opportunity. But also the players that were involved early on weren't necessarily cannabis-oriented people. There were a lot of barriers, I guess you could say, for the smaller companies or individuals like myself to get involved at the time. Financial barriers and compliance. To get a license and everything, you had to have a facility, you had to have fully staffed, and basically that vetted out 99% of the people that were actually cannabis people, because no one could afford a multi-million-dollar facility and then have 15 people on payroll for 2 years while you wait for your license. Of course, having a family, I've got 3 kids, and trying to figure out how to support the family and provide for the kids over the years has also been a challenge, as it is, you know, for anybody, but it definitely wasn't a career path that I was expecting.
When I started putting together a list of the things that you've done, and you've added a few: carpenter, heavy equipment operator, you were a multi-million-dollar developer, you were the author of The Chain, you're a philanthropist, you're an outspoken advocate and entrepreneur for cannabis, you were almost a politician, you're a partner, you've got 3 kids, and you're pretty much a philosopher. You know, and I'm quite struck by the way you've gone through life with some real highs and some real lows. And as you sit in front of us today, you're a pretty normal, down-to-earth guy. That's a lot of stuff to go through. So how do you do it?
Yeah, I think one day at a time is the best way I can describe it. I mean, there are days where the stresses of life are overwhelming, and then there's other days where, you know, everything seemingly is incredible. So, you know, I've had a lot of things presented to me, you know, as opportunities, like winning the Olympics, for example, and being on The Tonight Show, and doing Conan O'Brien, and having Saturday Night Live do stuff, and Robin Williams talking about me on his New York Live. And all of these things, you know, the average person would seemingly believe that from that amount of exposure that there's definitely going to be an opportunity to capitalize and to be able to earn a living from that sort of exposure. But I've learned that it's not always like that. You can be famous, but it doesn't mean you're going to be rich and famous. And I think that being famous or known is kind of like my side gig, and my day job is making sure that I can pay the bills, get my kids to dance competitions and hockey games and football games. And, you know, if the kids need soccer cleats or rollerblade wheels, you know, that I can actually go and buy that stuff. And yeah, it's some days not as easy as you'd want it to be able to do that.
What do you see as the big issues in front of you?
The regulations and the compliance and the taxation on cannabis kind of presents our biggest hurdle. Right now, I'm basically doing it for no money, just to get the brand out there. There's almost zero margin. But it was always a quest of mine since Nagano to help legalize cannabis, and then for me to have my own brand in the market. And for the most part, I've gone down that road. 25 years, we made it. I got my product in the stores. I'm pumped. And now we got to find a way to make money. And if it wasn't for the fact that I'm the only guy in the company, I don't know if we would have survived, because some companies have upwards of, a dozen or more people working for them. And so as long as I don't give up, the brand will survive. So we're getting there. And I think over the next 12 months, we're going to see a little bit of resurgence and money coming into the industry. I think there was a bad taste left in a lot of people's mouths after the last, say, 10 years of investments going into publicly traded cannabis companies. We always said from the beginning, like, this isn't going to work out. These guys don't know cannabis. It's just a public stock play and nothing more. There were, some upside to it, but then since then, it's pretty much hit the ground hard. And so now we're starting to see the emergence of craft micro facilities that are coming up with amazing products with the most incredible terpene profiles and crosses with different strains and stuff that I think is going to be the resurgence of the mom and pop part of the cannabis industry.
There was a time when you were considering running for office or getting politically involved. Would you still do it?
Yeah, I think about it a lot, actually. That was around 14 or 15 years ago. I ran for MP and won my nomination and was in Ottawa making speeches in French and English. And
Questions orales, oral questions.
Yeah, really got a taste for what it is to be a politician and how you have to kind of have that thick skin to be able to handle, as they say, it doesn't matter who you are, you can't win all the votes. So it's almost impossible to get through a day probably as a politician and feel awesome at the same time. So I do think about it quite a bit. Like, would there be an opportunity for me down the road to get back into it, maybe as MP? I don't know. I think for right now, my main focus is just making sure that I can support the family and get, my kids are like 8, 11, and 14. And I think once they're a little bit older and they don't need me around as much, then maybe things will be more clear to me then.
So we'll stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Let's talk about Ross Gold. What makes it stand out? What makes it different?
Our main mission for Ross Gold is basically to provide quadruple A product and get behind it with also quadruple A brand with a great brand story. But even with all the great story and everything that we have, we still have to hit the ground as hard as possible. We still have to pound the pavement like everybody else. It's not a given that people know my story. It's an older story now. Some of the younger generation doesn't know who I am. And so we really need to be able to be in front of the people and get out across the country and be behind the brand as much as anybody else. Where we like to pride ourselves in knowing as much about cannabis as we do, where we can actually source out the best weed because we know what it looks like, we know what it smells like, we know what it tastes like, and we know what it feels like. And then also the fact that, we can openly source different products as well. So we're looking at another product called Stick It that is an infused hemp stick that you can insert into a joint and infuse it with CBD, for example, or THC.
The first product you launched coincided with the day you won in Nagano?
Yeah, isn't that incredible? February 8th, 1998 was the day I won in Nagano. And then February 8th, 2023, which is exactly 25 years to the day, was the first day that we were available in stores with the Ross Gold products. And that was not planned at all. Nothing in the cannabis industry is planned, but that came together and was very serendipitous of my manifestation of what I was trying to accomplish with cannabis. And like my lawyer always said, let's turn this mess into a success. And that's what I was trying to do for 25 years. And it just came together on February 8th, 2023, 25 years to the day. It was unbelievable that it came down to February 8th, all those years later. And then we can see what I would have done 25 years before that if that never would have happened. It would have been something else gold, like a gold snowboard or gold goggles or something to do with snowboard equipment or a line of clothing, snowboard gear, my own custom boots, who knows, like it could be anything. Because it was cannabis, it took a lot longer, and I probably missed that window slightly of being able to capitalize on it. It was more than money to me to come out with the cannabis brand, to come out with the Ross Gold brand and in support of cannabis. That was more for me, it was like a personal quest that I was on to right the wrongs that I felt had been given at the time and to play the best hand that I could to resurrect my name, my family name, and to also stand up for the people that supported me in cannabis and the people who use cannabis. By 1998, I already was using cannabis for almost 10 years. I was 26. I kind of started using it on a regular basis by the time I was 19. I knew cannabis worked for me on my level, but in those days before the internet, we had no information about cannabis, really. I just knew how I felt. I was using it to go to the gym. I was using it for endurance training on my road bike. I used it at the end of the day instead of drinking. And, over the years, alcohol started getting into my life more and more, especially after the Olympics, dealing with all of this stuff. I think everybody grows up thinking like, oh, somehow they have to master the art of drinking. And so I felt like that was what I was doing, was getting better at it, getting good at it, where I could wake up, not feel a hangover. And that was, for me, was a success. I'm like, oh, I'm growing up. I can finally handle my alcohol. But just with the convoluted nature of my life at the time, dealing with all these things, I noticed that alcohol was just becoming more and more of a complication in my life and creating problems where I didn't need problems. And what I was going through was already tricky enough, let alone mix alcohol into it. And so I ended up one day just giving it up, just be like, that's it. I'm going to make a change. I have to do something. This is the one thing that I feel like I can do, that I can be in control of. Instead of everything feeling like out of control all the time, I just wanted to take the control back again for the millionth time, fall back on cannabis for that relief at the end of the day. Get all that shit off the back from dealing with bills and whatever you have to deal with in a day. Working construction, like why is Ross Rebagliati building houses? Why did he just walk onto our job site wearing a tool belt? Like that was weird for the guys I was working with until we got to know each other, right? It was weird for me and it was weird for them. Like they don't want to not give me a job. That's Ross Rebagliati. He needs a fucking job. Give him a job. And so it was about just normalizing the fact that I'm just a normal guy and I need to make a living like everybody else. The perception was definitely out there and still is to this day that I'm a big philanthropist and that I have all this extra money that I've earned somehow from something over the years. Even like the cannabis, people would assume that I made money from that so far, but I haven't. I haven't made any money. The margins are so slim that you don't make any money. I even lost some money last year. So for me, it's personal. And that's actually the slogan of our company is it's personal. We definitely are doing this for a different reason than everybody else. I'd like to think that we can create a luxury cannabis brand, like a premium brand within cannabis. And that cannabis would also rise up out of the shadows a little bit more at the same time. And hopefully we can have something to do with that as well. I'd love to see a point where I can have money flowing to charity from the profits of the company. I would love to be able to use some of that, money to market the company and put the company name on surfboards and kite sails and be able to sponsor race cars and people that are racing in triathlons and athletes. And right now we're not allowed to fuse those two things together, and just kind of open up the market and basically try to normalize. I'd love if we could be part of normalizing cannabis use, where it gets to the point where instead of smoking a cigarette on the patio at the bar, you're drinking a cannabis drink, smoking a joint. Not every cannabis company has a platform, where they can get that sort of message out. So I'd like to think that Ross Gold would be able to carry a message like that. The amount of people and the diversity of people that use cannabis is mind-blowing to the average person. Like, you wouldn't think judges and lawyers and politicians and doctors would use cannabis, but they are.
Well, thanks to the Canadian podcast new host, Ross Rebagliati, for that interview and for sharing his story. Stick around for future episodes with Ross. The Canadian podcast is an Everything Podcast production in partnership with Ripco.pro. The opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the podcast team or our partners. This show is intended for a 19-plus audience. Thanks to our creative director, Cliff Dumas, showrunner Karen Habashi, senior writer Jay Coburn, and our sound engineer, John Massacre. I'm Don Schaefer. Thanks for listening to the Canadian Podcast, the authority on cannabis in Canada. Another Everything Podcast production. Visit everythingpodcast.com, a division of Pattison Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast.